Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Terumos, Perek Vav, Halacha Beis, and Gimel. We're learning today Daf Samach Aleph, God willing, going all the way to the end of the 6th chapter. We left off on Daf Samach Aleph, Amud Aleph, 2 lines from the top of the Amud by the 2 dots. And we're going to go a little bit back to the case that we just left off from, contrasting it with the case prior to that, in which a person steals truma and then they eat it, for which the chayiv to pay 2 kiranim and then to pay 1 chaimish. And the question would be, why is it that when someone was magdish truma and someone eats it, we already covered the 2 chaimishes. However, we are to understand it, machlokes that we had yesterday, we have to first quickly address, why is it that you won't be chayiv to pay kefil? Because of the act of theft, right? Prior to eating it, you took it. And as we'll see that there's no kefil by Hegdish. We spoke this out when we learned the Mishnah. And the primary focus that we will have on Amud Aleph before this, the third and final Mishnah, will be when the Mishnah says, regarding, quoting first Rabbi Meir, that leket, shikha, peya, hefket, meiser rishoin, shenitla, trumasai, meiser sheni, vehegdish, shenivdu, none of them could be used for the keren v'chaimish. And when we learned the Mishnah, we explained that when you pay the penalty, the keren and the chaimish from chulin misukanim, it has to be a chulin, I'm using the words of Chazal, that have in it zikas trumais umaisris, which means it has to be a chulin that already has a connection with trumais umaisris. It must be chulin that at some point in its past, it could have become truma, which is why now, when you separate it, it indeed will become kodesh. It will become imbued with kedushas truma. And therefore, all of the items mentioned, as we'll review it when we go inside, none of them ever were able to become truma, because these are items from where one is exempt to separate trumas from maasros, doesn't have the status of tevel, and therefore it cannot be used. That's what we said when we learned the Mishnah. And then the Chachamim matirim be'elu, they permit with these. Now, the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir mentioned leket, shikha, peya, hefker, meiser rishon, shenitr tlomasai, meiser sheni, vehegdish, sheniftu, many items. What exactly, in which items are the Chachamim arguing, and what will be the basis of their argument? That will be the topic that we will have until Samach Aleph Amid Beis, until the third Mishnah. The third Mishnah will speak more about the keren v'chaimish payment. We're going to have the general machlokes in the Mishnah. Are you obligated to pay from the same type of what you ate? So if a person ate b'shoigeg apples, are they chayiv to pay back with apples? Only min al minoi, or is one allowed to pay min al she'enoi minoi? Machlokes we'll see in the Mishnah between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva. There'll be also a discussion whether one is allowed to pay back from superior product. We'll explain what that means when we learn inside. This is primarily a question on the opinion that says that you are allowed to pay mimin al she'enoi minoi. So you have to know how to classify what type is considered inherently superior to the other. We're not talking about something like better apples versus worse apples. We're speaking about if you're going to pay, if a person ate vegetables and they want to pay with figs, is fig an item that's called superior? If you are allowed to pay mimin al she'enoi minoi, then you would pay with figs. Or are figs considered inferior to vegetables, for example? And therefore, even if you are allowed to pay mimin al she'enoi minoi, but you can't pay with figs because you're giving something that is inferior, that's going to be a big topic. We will also see, hopefully till the end of the Perek, that the same rule of the penalty of paying keren v'chaimish applies to bikurim. Same thing, if a person eats bikurim b'shoigeg, they have to pay keren v'chaimish. Same thing will be with challah. All of these, we already said many times, have the same kedusha of truma. Same idea that if a person eats challah b'shoigeg, they're chayv to pay the keren v'chaimish, and a lot of nuance and details. That will be the end of today's daf, all the way to the end of the Perek. We are dedicating this class, l'refuah shalema, to Levi Halevi ben Leah, Chevra Samach Aleph Amud Aleph, 2 lines from the top of the Amud. So the case that we just left off from, whether you learn like Rabbi Yanai, whether we'll learn like Rav Kahana, is that when someone who had truma, who then consecrated the truma to the Beis Hamikdash, so now it has double kedusha, and now someone went and ate it b'shoigeg, 1 keren, 2 chaimish, however you understand the 2 chaimish, why not 2 kerens? In other words, the Mishnah began by telling you that for the act of theft, before you ate, you're chayiv kefil. Why isn't there two kedens? She'ein, says the Mishnah says why? Because she'ein behegdish tashlumei kefil. As a rule, yeah, if a person takes from hegdish, there are other dinim. What happens if you do it b'mezid? What happens if you do it b'shegeg? The whole idea of kefil is not shayich if the item belongs to the temple. The Gemara simply wants to know its source. Shenemar in Parshas Mishpatim Yishalem Shnayim, and then the Torah adds a word that l'chayda you can say is superfluous. Lireyeyu, and lireyeyu is to teach not superfluous that the din of Yishalem Shnayim, you got to pay double, is only if you took it from your fellow, and that excludes v'loy lahegdish. Okay. Now, here's the bulk of today's topic before the next Mishnah. So we have again Rab Meir and the Chachamim. Rab Meir says, guys, remember, leket, shikha, peya, hefker. Now, we already covered leket, shikha, peya are items from which you don't have to tithe anything. Hefker is something from which you don't have to tithe anything. That we got. The other ones are a little bit different. My sedition was an item that you can argue was tevel. Yes and no. Because what happens to chulin is that you have tevel, you separated what you needed from it, and then the remainder goes from being tevel to being chulin. That could have been the truma, which is why, that's the whole logic behind Rabbi Meir, only an item that already had a connection to truma could be used for payment, tashlume truma, because it will become truma, because it already had a zikas, a connection to truma. Ma'aser rishon shenitlu trumase, am I understanding? It's two steps. Tevel became ma'aser rishon. You're right. It could have become truma, not ma'aser rishon. But even after it became ma'aser rishon, you still cannot eat it. Something has to happen to it. And that is, you got to remove the trumas meiser from it. And then what happens? It's not chulin. It's a, my sedition is not chulin misukanim. Since my sedition is not chulin misukanim, it's my sedition. You can't use that. My sheni shenivdu cannot be used. Why not? Because Rab Meir holds, that's how we explain the Mishnah, that Maise Sheni, before it was redeemed, is not yours. You cannot pay with something that's not yours. Now you redeemed it. Since there was a time that it Bechlal wasn't yours, you can't use it. And that will be the logic behind Hefker. That's Rav Meir. And the Chachamim are matir. With which ones? Bo'elu. That has to be clarified. So the Gemara says, when the Chachamim atinim be'elu, so we have a machlekes here. What are the Chachamim allowing? On what of the items do they argue with Rabbi Meir? So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, that they only argue al tartein achreyasa on the two latter ones. Now the two latter ones, just for the record, are not Ma'aser Sheni, Sheniftu, and Hegda Sheniftu. That's considered one. They argue al Ma'aser Rishon Shenitla Trumasoi and on Ma'aser Sheni and Hegda Sheniftu. And why do they argue with those? Why do they allow you to pay your tashlume truma from it? Because they hold mipnei sheyesh bohem zikas truma umaisres, because they were once connected. Ma'aser Rishon originally was tevel. Instead of it becoming Ma'aser Rishon, it could have become truma. Let's look inside the Marafulda. Let's read a lot of Marafulda today. 5 lines from the top, right? Beginning with the narrow lines. There was a time that they were ra'ui liyois truma umaiser, and therefore al kain shaper motzinu lemeimar buhu davar haroi liyos kodesh. Masha'ein kain, says the Marafulda, understands Reish Lakish in the Chachamim that they agree with Rabbi Meir that when it comes to the leket and to the shikha, to the pay and to the hefker, these are items me'olam lehoyu ru'uyim letruma sumaisres. Then the Rabbanan will be moidem Words, both Rav Meir and the Chachamim begin from the premise that what is allowed to be used for payment, something that itself could have already been Truma. That's why it's open to becoming Truma. So I'm saying my sedition has to be explained. Why not? I was explaining because it's not Chulin Misukanim. My Sheni and Hegdish L'Rab Meir. They were my Sheni L'Rab Meir. Hegdish. There was a time that it was not even yours. If it's not even yours, even though now it became yours, you can't use it for payment. And the Chachamim say, I don't care about yours, not yours. Of course, now it has to be yours. If there was a zikas trumas umaisris, you can make payment. If that is what you are understanding, that the Chachamim are moided to this yisoid, that anything that has a zikas truma could be used for payment. So the question is, v'leket v'shikcha ein bahem mishum zikas truma isumaisris. Now, guys, for those of us who learned from the beginning, right? We learned extensively in Mesechtes Peah. We went through all of these dinim. So let's quickly review leket, shikcha, and peah. I'll go backwards. Peah are items, ideally, that you never even harvested, which means these are items prior to the harvest. It's not shayach for you to separate trumas umaisris. By the way, after the harvest, you're not obligated to separate trumas umaisris. What do you have to wait for, Aviv? You have to wait for the goyden, for the smoothing of the pile. But if someone decided to be magdim b'shibalin, what the person did is effective. Shayach. So peah, I get, is not shayach to ever becoming truma because you left it on the field before you harvested it. But think about what's leket. Leket is that when you're cutting the wheat with your sickle, you have the wheat is in one hand, the sickle is in the other hand. We learned a lot of details. So if you have one or two stalks that after you cut it, it fell out of your hand to the ground, and we're going to go into this debate. Does it become leket when it fell out of your hand? Does it become leket when it hit the ground? It might be consequential here. That Lamay Nafkamino over there is very simple. If it fell out of your hand and you grabbed it with the other hand, is it yours or is it already the ani's? Or if it becomes leket because it fell out of your hand, then you can't grab it back. If it only becomes leket when it hit the ground, because this nuance will be negaya right over here. Point is, I don't understand. Leket, let's say that it only becomes leket when it hits the ground. Let's go with that. So when it's going down, the person could have said, this is truma. Leket had a moment where it was tevel prior to it becoming leket, so there's a zika. Same thing with shikha. The normal shikha means you already cut the bundles. The moment you harvested something, even though you're not chayiv to tithe it, it could be tithed. Then when you're picking up your bundles, you forgot one or two. Prior to that, it could have become truma. So that's what the Gemara is asking. Leket and shikha.
Why wouldn't you say the same thing on peah? Peah, you designate which part.
Even though we learned, to be honest, that if a person forgot to do the ideal peah, which is to leave it connected, then you have to leave peah from what that you gathered. Emes, the Gemara is going to say that in a moment. But the ideal peah is not even to harvest it, to leave whatever you will leave on the field connected. Danny, when things are connected to the ground, even if someone were to declare that this part of my field, while it's connected as truma, it's a nonsensical statement. It's ineffective. Shlish means that if you harvested something prior to reaching a shlish, you'll never be chayiv to tithe it. But it has to be harvested. The only item that we give while connected, my friends, is bikurim. And the Gemara is going to get to that soon. Bikurim is different. But trumas umaisris, you have to have it harvested. For it to be shayach, again, you're only chayiv by the Gemara Malacha. But once you harvested it, you could. So the Gemara asks, that's a great question. So answers the Gemara, Ella, this is just to substantiate Reish Lakish. Because if not for Reish Lakish, you know what I would have said? The Chachamim are matirim be'elu. Okay, so the Chachamim allow you to pay with leket because there is a zika. They allow you to pay with shikha. But Reish Lakish says, no, they only argue with the latter. They don't argue with the originals, with the earlier ones. Ella must be that where do the Chachamim agree with Rav Meir? First of all, B'neshidas leket. B'neshidas leket will mean that not the way you thought, that leket, aviv, only becomes leket when it hits the ground. For you to ask, when it was flying down, you could have said truma. No, the moment it fell out of your hand, it became leket. So we shortened the time. The truth is, the Gemara is going to assume, so what? So what? Before it fell out of your hand. We're going to have that kasha later. But at least we're saying, no. Right away, you grabbed it. You have to also appreciate, we learned this in Masechtas Pei. You grab it with one hand, you use the keli in the other hand. Actually, many times, the keli itself, ripped it out of your hand. There is a pshat to say, if it's right out, if it falls out of your hand, so that's the pshat, that b'neshidas leket, from when it began to fall out of your hand, that is when it becomes leket. You didn't have time to designate it. And when the Mishnah speaks about, shikha, so let me tell you something important. This we learned, that there's taka two shikchas. There is the shikha of the bundle, there's another shikha. When you are going down your rows to cut, you walked by two bundles and you didn't even cut it. There is a shikha that's still connected to the ground. That's called kama shikha. That our Mishnah is speaking about, first of all, halachically, leket is from the neshira, not from when it hits the ground. That the Mishnah shikha is bekama shikha, and peya is a given. Ubekamas peya non kaiminon. That would work. Problem with that would be, the Gemara is asking a kasha on Reish Lakish, that in the Masechtas Peah, we had a inquiry asked by Chilfai, which, as we mentioned, is who we call in the Babli Ilfa. What did he ask? He asked the question whether a person who had the one or two stalks flying out of his hand before hitting the ground, are you allowed to grab it from the air? And if you did that, is it yours or is it too late? He had a doubt. L'chu'ura, if Reish Lakish's pshat in the Mishnah is correct, our Mishnah should have resolved this inquiry. Based on the premise that if it only becomes leket when it hits the ground, the Chachamim would argue with it. Because prior to hitting the ground, you could have made it into truma. There is a zikas truma. So that's the Gemara's kasha. If that will be the case, will this not resolve the inquiry of Chilfa? The Chilfa didn't know whether leket becomes leket. Leket b'neshira ma'ushi kaddish. When it fell out of your hand prior to hitting the ground, the word kaddish means, does it have the status of leket or not? He didn't know that. And why didn't Chilfai resolve his inquiry from our Mishnah? If Reish Lakish is correct that the Chachamim are moide to Rav Meir, because there is no zika, it can only fit if it becomes leket right away. The Gemara doesn't have an answer. The Gemara doesn't need to have an answer, because anyways, Rabbi Yechanan is going to refute Reish Lakish, as we'll see right now. So Rabbi Yechanan Amalei, Rabbi Yechanan says, V'ho taninon leket. The Mishnah says leket, Islach meimar beleket kepeya. You can't. The Mishnah is putting together leket and peya. Peya I accept. When we're speaking about peya, as we mentioned, even though that there is a b'diavad dika peya, there is such a thing, that if a person harvested their entire field, we learned in Masechtas Peah, you have to leave the peya all the way down to the flower. You have to make it up. You should have left. But peya is something that's meant to be left on the field. Leket by default is that you cut it off. Leket is only shayach when you cut it off. After cutting, before falling, there is still a window of time. So why, in other words, you grace a teretz. Now when it hit the ground, that's when it falls out of your hand. So what? Prior to it falling out of your hand, it's already cut off. And in that instant, you could have said, this is truma. And it would have been effective. And because of that, Rabbi Yechanan Amalei al kulhain. Look inside the second to last line in the Marah folder. That al kol hani demasnisin pligid abanon fak adarabba. The Chachamim, one thing stands clearly. The Rabbanan agree with Rav Meir that you can only pay tashlumei truma from something that at some point could have had zikas truma. happens to be that every single case of the Mishnah is something that you can argue there is a zikas truma. Which is what? Now let me say one thing, guys. Leket we already explained. Leket has a moment. Even if it becomes leket right after it flew out of your hand, when you cut it before it flew out of your hand. Shikchas kama never had zikas truma. That means if the shikha that the Mishnah would have been referring to would have been that you're walking down your rows and you forgot to cut a bundle off the ground that's still standing, that cannot be truma. Once it's declared shikha and now you process it, everyone will be moide. You cannot pay keren v'chaymish from it. But when the Mishnah is speaking about shikha, the normal shikha is not shikha skama, shikha seimanim. Shikha seimanim is what we always have in mind, that you harvested. You have these bundles laying on the field. Now you're coming to collect them, and you walked by one or two. And that is already disconnected off the ground, and these items could have been made into truma. And the same thing with peya, even with peya. Now, how can the Chachamim argue with anything? Didn't we just say that peya means you got to leave it on the ground? You're right. And again, the Chachamim, according to the Marafulda, will be moida that this type of peya, even the Chachamim, cannot be used for payment, but they still argue with Rav Meir. You know why? Because Rav Meir says peya cannot be used. The Chachamim disagree with it. The Chachamim say depends what peya. Because like we also mentioned, b'di'eved, if you harvested your whole field and then you chapped, I didn't leave peya, that's called peya, peyas oimadim, you're chayiv to leave peya from the bundles. Once it's already disconnected, prior to you declaring this one as peya, you could have declared this one as truma, after declaring another one as peya. In other words, you can't say without any qualification that leket shikho peya cannot be used. If chachamim matirim be'elu would mean, I'll call elu. And Eshlakish argues with that.
Why did we not enter? Why is this mission not approved to Philippi?
In other words, that's a kasha only on Eshlakish. We didn't answer that question. The Gemara didn't find it necessary. It sounds like because the Gemara accepts Rabbi Yechanan's understanding to be the authoritative understanding. Period. In other words, our Mishnah doesn't weigh in. Does not weigh in. Because leket kutak can be paid. Whether leket becomes leket only when it hits the ground, whether leket becomes leket the moment it fell out of your hand, the mind of Kamina. Prior to that, there was a zikas truma. There was a moment where it could have become truma. Okay. Atkan, and now we're moving on to the final Mishnah in this Perek. Daf Samach Aleph Amid Beis. And the first is a machlokes. In the intro, I said Chachamim. I stand corrected. It's between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. And that is, let's go back to the normal, just a normal case, right? A person they ate wheat. Truma, b'shoigig, they have to pay from chulin misukanen, keren v'chaimish. Are they chayiv to pay back with wheat, or could they use another type? Rabbi Eliezer Oimer, that you are allowed mishalmin mimin al she'enu minoi. But there's a caveat. When you're paying mimin al minoi, apples for apples. If you're paying for wheat with something else, you have to make sure that that something else is somehow defined as superior. What you may not do is to pay from another min that's considered inferior. We'll have in the Gemara some examples, few examples of that. And whether those examples are tolui bismanu b'makoim, whether they are absolute, I don't know. Well, let's go. Ubevad sheyishalem min hayafa al hora. Okay. Now, all of that is shitas Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva doesn't have to worry about you pay min hayafa al hora because Rabbi Akiva argues with the whole thing. Rabbi Akiva oimer no ein mishalem ela min al minoi. Very simple. Now, the lefikach goes on Rabbi Akiva. We're going to have a challenge. What will be the challenge? So the Mishnah gives an example of kishuyin, whatever they are. Let's go. It's gourds. Gourds is something that at the end of the year, it becomes hardened, and halachically it's considered another min, even though it's still edible in a different way. But kishuyim fresh versus kishuyim, the kishuyim from the 6th year, by the time it goes into the 7th year, becomes so hard, it's considered al she'ein minoi. Now, I'm saying 6th year dafka, because if a person ate truma of the 5th year, kishuyim, And Rabbi Akiva says you have to pay back with kishuyin. Okay, so if you realize what you did a year later, pay back from the kishuyin of the 6th year. You ate fresh kishuyin. That's called min al minoi. But as we will see, it's a given that one is not allowed to pay from product of shvius for tashlumei truma. And we're gonna go until the end of the Perek. Aside of the issue of svichem, side of that, we'll see. Regardless, I'm not allowed to use, just like I'm not allowed to do schoide with Perek shvius. Tashlumei truma is al derech, paying that back a debt with produce of shvius. Even if it's a product that may be eaten, I cannot use it for this purpose. So, Rabbi Akiva, what are you going to do? You ate it on the 6th. Now, of course, if you realized what you did, Aviv, a minute later, an hour later, a day later, a week later, pay back from the kishoyim of the 6th year. But if you realized it months later, and at this time you have kishoyim, but they became hard, and therefore they're called a different type halachically, and the solution cannot be to pay from kishoyin of shvius, because again, it's a given. You cannot use product of shvius to pay tashlumei truma. So you'll be obliged yamtin lekishuyim shel mitzvah shvius v'yishalamehem. Rabbi Eliezer, you have no issue. You know why? Rabbi Eliezer will agree with this rule that you're not allowed to pay from tashlumei, from shvius. Now, first of all, you can pay min al she'ena minoi. Now, if you're going to argue, which I think, that hardened kishuyim are considered ra, inferior, and you cannot pay inferior for superior, so pay from another product. You don't have to give back kishuyim. Give back a product that is considered yafa, any other product. This is an issue with Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara is going to ask a simple kasha. I don't understand. Shvius is only noig ba'aretz. Why didn't you pay back with kishuyim of the 7th year that grew in another place?
Can you pay back cash?
No, you cannot. No one says cash. That's the
Wait,
whole.
but I thought when you're paying it back, it becomes truma.
So the Gemara is going to ask that ma'arotzois that are semuchos l'Eretz Yisrael, Bavel, right? Bavel, Ammon, Moav, and Mitzrayim. I know it's midrabanan, but the Gemara finds that to be good enough items that have
Is
a
Surya included in there?
Even more. I didn't mention Surya because Surya is even more, I think. Don't forget, Surya was conquered by David HaMelech. The issue was, it's called Kibush Yachid.
Can I ask you a question, Rabbi?
Yeah. Yes.
Why do we have to talk about gourds and shvias and all that? How about there's no more available of the item that you ate? There's no more peaches because the season's over.
You wait till next year.
Now
you wait till next year.
You gotta wait till next year. Why is that any different?
Difference is that instead of waiting 1 year, you're waiting 2 years. It's so important to follow these rules that, normally when it comes to financial restitution, pay back the sooner the better. Here, no, it doesn't work that way. There's a lot of kapara needed, and kapara has to happen. What happens if a person does a sin and there's no sheep? And that's the same question. You have to wait until you get a sheep. If the animal need is that animal, what are you going to do? One of the secondary reasons why they were ma'abed Shana is for there to be more animals for Korban Pesach Kapshutay. Not a primary reason, it's a secondary reason. Okay, now says the Mishnah, Mimokim Shirabi Eliezer Mekel. This machloikis mimin al she'enoi minoi, or only mimin al minoi, is learned both by Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva from the same source, that Rabbi Eliezer learns his leniency that you are allowed to be mishalim mimin al she'enoi minoi misham Rabbi Akiva's mach. And what is that source? Because it says again the pasuk in Emor ve'ish ki yoichal kodesh bishgaga v'yasav chamishisay olav, and now quotes the Mishnah the nasan lakoyin es hakodesh. So the S hakodesh, if I understand correctly, the S is always including something, right? S l'rabbeis talmidei chachamim S Hashem alekecha tira. So kol shuhu roi layosis kodesh. Anything doesn't have to be mimin al minoi. Yes, the rule that we just came off learning, it has to be something that has zikas truma, but S anything. So that's from the S, the way I divided Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Akiva learns it from the Hey, because the Torah could have said, "V'nasan lakoyin esh kodesh, ha kodesh." Kiva oimen no, v'nasan lakoyin ha kodesh. Kodesh achal, the one, the type that he ate, only the type that he ate, and not from another type. That's the machlokes of how you do limudim. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. Okay, Now, even though the Mishnah spoke about Rabbi Eliezer, that you can give mimin al she'ein minoi, but you can only give it from superior on inferior. So says the Gemara, examples. The Gemara is going to give you two examples. Haketzad. So the Gemara gives as a rule that figs, I think it means any fruits, but it could be only figs. Vis-a-vis vegetables, figs are considered superior even if they are dried. Even if they're not fresh, fruits versus vegetables, achal yarak, the shilem, groigeres, you can pay. You can pay with, that's called minayafa. Or if in fruits itself, dried figs, dates. Again, I don't know if it's dry to fresh or if it's dafka figs and dates. I don't know, but these are the two examples the Gemara gives. And on that we say, Tavai loy bracha, which means, make no mistake, Rabbi Eliezer is not demanding that you have to pay from something superior. You can pay mimin al minoi. So if a person had an option, a person ate dried figs, b'shoigeg, and they have both chulin, dried figs, and they have tomatum, they have dates. If they pay from Yafa, first of all, you are allowed, and since it's mina Yafa Allah, it's actually a good thing. Rabbi Eliezer is makel by allowing this to function. The value will be the same, most important to note. It doesn't mean that you're giving something less valuable. It might mean that you give less quantity of it, might mean, because it's going to end up being the same. I think there is a debate whether it's value, whether it's volume. Could be there's a machlekes about this, independent of this. This is just an analysis of what's considered ra, what's considered yafa. When you're going mimin al she'ein minoi. One thing we know that wheat and barley, we know there's some other areas in halacha that barley is considered inferior. Wheat is considered superior. That means if a person ate truma so'oirim b'shoigeg l'Rabbi Eliezer, you can pay with chitim. Now the Gemara wants to know, as we mentioned in the intro, the same rule of truma is the same rule by bikurim. Achal bikurim mao mishalim. There are many different ways of understanding this question. Let us follow the Rashi Ilio. Have a look in the left column, the third, fourth line from the top. Achal bikurim mao mishalim. First of all, the Rashi Ilio establishes that since bikurim, when consumed b'mezid, has the penalty of misa b'dei shamayim, and now when you eat it b'shoigeg, you also have to pay back not only that which you took, v'choimish, lizar, mamish ketruma, kidetram b'pedig beis bikurim. So now, and not only that, v'tashlum mehem nami bikurim. That's another big statement. Not truma, bikurim. There's a discussion about that. So first of all, he's giving a couple of premises. We're going with first of all, bikurim is like truma. If someone ate it b'shoigeg aviv, you got to pay back keren v'choimish. Number two, it is the keren and the choimish will be imbued with bikurim. Okay, now what's the question? Ul Rabbi Akiva koboy. The kiv and the bikurim less nahu b'mashke. Bikurim comes only from the shivas haminim. Right, shenashtapcha behem eretz Yisrael. None of them are liquids. You have over there the geffen. You have over there the olives. But bikurim is not given in wine. So he wants to know, according to Rabbi Eliezer, amazing, that you are allowed to pay mimin al she'ein minoi. We're going again with the premise, it's self-understood from the Rashi Ilio, that wine is superior to grapes, and olive oil is superior to olives. So if a person, b'shoigeg, ate bikurim, and they want to give back payment with wine and with oil, you can do that. That's a given, because you can give mimin al she'ein minoi, and you're giving, again, these liquids are superior. The kasha that the Gemara is asking, according to the Rav Shirilio, that according to Rabbi Akiva, that you're not allowed to pay back mimin al she'ein minoi, the question is, maybe wine is still considered minoi. Maybe olive oil is considered minoi, and you will be allowed to pay back as an option. Of course, if a person ate bikurim grapes, well, the solution would be is pay back bikurim grapes. Just add a choimish. I got that. We want to know whether you are allowed. That's the way the Rashi understands the kasha. And the Gemara answers that, again, according to him, even according to Rabbi Akiva, that if achal anavim, you are allowed to pay back with yayin. And if you eat zeisim, you are allowed to pay back with oil. Nekuda. Now, I want you to know that there is a machlokes, even though the Rashirilio sides with the fact that the payment becomes bikurim, but there is a big machlokes whether the payment is bikurim or whether the payment is truma. And Aviv, what would be the nafkamina if it's bikurim or truma? Don't forget, you're going to give it back to the coin from whom you took it. Either you took it from a coin who received bikurim, or you're going to give it back to the coin who received the truma. But what's the big difference between bikurim and truma? Truma is allowed to be eaten anywhere. Bikurim is not bound to be eaten inside the walls of Yerushalmi. Bikurim has to be eaten inside Yerushalmi and Akodah, big nafkamina, whether it has which status. Again, the Rashirilio said that. I want you to know that there's a whole talk about that. Everything comes from the same pasuk. The kodesh in Parshas Emor, it means truma. Okay, weiter. And now the third topic, challah, same thing. I'm a Yisrael. I'm not allowed to eat challah. If a Yisrael eats challah b'shoige kid din truma, they're chayv to pay back keren b'choimish. So now achal challah. Now something was mentioned by Rabbi Mendel before, and now it's going to be negeya. And I want to say the following: items. Produce that never reached either a shlish, or the way that Rambam defines it, the magic about the shlish is that when does something have the ability to procreate when it itself reached its shlish? It's connected. So whatever. If something never hit a third of its growth and it was harvested, these items, Aviv, are not obligated to be tithed, but you are obligated to remove challah from it. Now that we established the first part of today's shir, that you can only pay back from something that has zikas truma, now you can nuance that. You can say that if a person, I'm going with the Rashirilio, that if you took bikurim, what you pay back becomes bikurim, which would then mean that if a person took challah, when they pay back keren v'chaimish from chulin misukanim, it becomes challah. I want to know whether I'm allowed to pay back this challah from flour that came from wheat that never reached a third of its development. That vadai cannot be used to pay back truma because there's no zikas truma. But since it's becoming challah, you can argue there is zikas challah because the din of challah doesn't travel in all of its rules on the same track of truma. Challah has to be taken from a dough, even if it was made from a flour. Shaloi hevi shlish. That's the Gemara's kasha. Gavaldik, right? Achal challah, mao sheishalami peiros, shaloi hevi shlish. And why would you be allowed shekain peiros, shaloi hevi shlish? It's we know you're not chayiv to tithe it. It's vaday not okay to use it for tashlumei truma, but maybe you can use it for tashlumei challah, chayavim b'challah. And look inside that Asherilio, 7 lines from the top, again on the left column. Peiros shaloi hevi shlish chayavim b'challah kedetran beperikama dechallah. And v'challah nami mikreis truma v'tashlumeha. Again, this is all the Rashirilio making sense of it. Havin challah. I'm adding that line. Bikurim, tashlume bikurim becomes bikurim. According to the Rash, tashlume challah becomes challah. I'm saying that, Aviv, because if tashlume challah becomes truma, then the Gemara L'chura would not have asked this question. How can you pay truma from something that never could become truma itself? No, that's why he said, since it's challah, maybe this will be okay. The Gemara does not answer the question, but it's a good question. Similar question. Achal bikurim. Like we mentioned also, challah, a truma somaisis, can only be given once the item was detached. Bikurim is something that's given, designated, not given, but designated and imbued with kedusha while attached. So if a person ate bikurim, is one allowed to do the tashlume bikurim from b'mechuber lekarka? Again, why? Shekena bikurim niknim b'mechuber lekarka. Or not. Now, why not? And the chanami, Tashlumi bikurim is bikurim, but all of this is learned from the pasuk that v'nasan lakoyin es hakodesh. The Torah in Tashlumen doesn't speak about bikurim, doesn't speak about challah. Gives you a rule about truma. So maybe everything has to have zikas truma, even though this is like a clause in truma. But if it's not shayach to the mother, it's not shayach to the child. The Gemara leaves the question unanswered. which is what about payah?
That you don't even harvest it. You connect, you pay back.
Bikurim from payah.
No, if a person ate payah.
No, if a person ate payah, no, there's no kedusha in payah. It's a matnas haniyim. It's a whole different din. There's no din of keren v'chaimish. There's no tashlumin of kodesh. There's tashlumin because of finances, financial tashlumin. Now, the final din in the Mishnah was Rabbi Akiva that you're not allowed to pay me min al she'ena minoi, and the issue was that you also cannot. And again, by gourds, we look at the hardened gourds as halachically another species. So therefore, if you ate it on the 6th year, and when you realize the current kishuyin are already hard, you have no option other than yamtin likishuyin shel matzoi shvis. Rab Ovin b'shem Rabbanan de Tamon says, zoy meres from our Mishnah. You see, she'ein mishalmin mipedes chutz la'aretz. Why is that? Because if you are allowed to pay mipedes chutz la'aretz, then we don't delay payment when one is able and willing. Go get imported produce and pay with it. The Gaba is asking, it has to be zikas trumas u'maisris, very important. So it must be that they felt that since midrabanan, you're chayiv to tithe produce from Bavel, from Ammon, from Moav, and from Mitzrayim, so we're going to say chayiv betruma. Perhaps, Danny, again, we're speaking about after the Churban Abayis, even in Eretz Yisrael, Truma, if we're going to go with the approach, we just spoke about this yesterday or 2 days ago, and we had this a lot, that even in the Holy Land, after Churban Bayis Sheni, Truma Sumaisis is midrabanan, then Vadai, you will be allowed to pay for eating Truma midrabanan with something that has Zikas Truma midrabanan. And why is it that that was not an option? So they said in Bavel is Arayah that you're not allowed to pay. You're not allowed to pay. Okay. And why is that? Because it's not chayiv enough. Maybe there's a difference. That's what they said in Bavel. There's a difference between something, my friends, even in the Holy Land, that is currently not chayiv midoiraisa because there's no Beis Hamikdash, versus a product michutz la'aretz that's inherently not chayiv. Never will be chayiv.
You say different type of derabbanans?
Different type of derabbanans. I think that's what they said in Bavel. And our Yerushalmi is disagreeing with that. I disagree with you. Maybe the derabbanans are the same. Elama, if you remember, prior to Rebbe, because the Chachamim, they made a 2-pronged gezerah, beginning with Gush Eretz Ha'amim. Is metame, because you might have a fragment of a cadaver in there, and then they added Avira the Eretz Ha'amim. We learned this together. And once they were masakin that the land outside the boundaries of Israel Aviv, in parts Tuma, there was a takana that you're not allowed to import vegetables, michutz la'aretz, period, because it's common that when you import vegetables come along with clods of earth, and they didn't want to bring in the physical earth of Eretz Ha'amim inside the Holy Land. So that's what Rabbeinu HaKadosh was mated it. Doesn't matter. This Mishnah was written before he was mated it. That's what Vafilu Tema Meshalmin. Masnisin is actually Hita Rebbe Lo Havi Yorig Chutz La'aretz La'aretz. So therefore that wasn't an option. But maybe inherently, especially if what you ate was Trumas D'Rabbanan, theoretically you are allowed to pay from Truma Midrabbanan, again from these 4 countries, Shinar, which is Bavel, Ammon, Moav, and Mitzrayim. And Daf Samach Beis, and let's finish the Perek. Okay. Now, the Gemara wants to make it clear that the reason why the option of paying back from fresh kishuyim that grew on the 7th year is not an option, one can erroneously think, why, Aviv? Because remember, you were here by Svichim, you were not here by Svichim. Svichim means if you don't plant something, but naturally seeds from certain, fruits, vegetables, produce, they fall on the ground, and it grows on its own. The Chachamim at a certain point said, not always, but in most, not from trees, but from items that you have to plant to get one harvest, not residual. That midrabanan, you're not allowed to eat svichim. So the Gemara wants to emphasize that that loy amar, our Mishnah, l'cha'ura, the Havamina, only spoke about the challenge by Kishuyim, and maybe because it's davar shu peiros isur, because since it's sfichem, that's why you cannot pay with it, which you might misunderstand by saying that if davar shu peiros heter, what happens if I have a fruit? Same idea. Certain fruits, when they're fresh, and even when they become hard and they're edible, they're considered another species. Peiros were never included in the Isur of Sfichem, because the whole reason why the Chachamim said Asur to eat Sfichem is because a person is going to plant it on purpose, and they're going to claim it was an aftergrowth. You don't have to plant an apple. You plant a tree once and it's residual. There's no problem by having that which grew on its own on the seventh year with all of the rules that we learned. So you will think that maybe the problem of paying with Kishuyin is only because it's Sfichem. Says the Gemara, no. Even on items that are not included in this Isur of eating Sfichem, you can never use product of Shvius to pay Tashlumei Truma. Why? She'im oimer at kain. If you will be allowed, how is this dissimilar? If a person, as an example, I borrowed your axe, and I broke your axe, and now I have to repay, I have a debt. I'm not allowed to pay down my debts from Peiros Shvius. All of this comes from the Isur of doing Schoida Bepeiros Shvius. Yes, I can sell a limited amount for me to eat, but not for me to pay down debts. That's included in business. Tashlumei Truma is also considered paying down a debt. And by the way, not only to give financial restitution, even paying my debt with God. In other words, I need a kapara. I cannot use peiros, and that's why the Mishnah says you can't do it. On that we say Chevra Hadan Allah Ha'echel Truma, and that was with the next Perek has the same name, Ha'echel Truma. The difference will be is that until now we were learning about someone who ate Truma b'shoigeg, and God willing tomorrow we're beginning a Perek of what happens if a person eats Truma b'meizeh. To be continued.